in 1927 and worked as a teacher in Douglas County schools for many, many years. Mildred and her husband, Jim, owned a ranch and lumber mill in Drain for nearly 70 years and generously gave back to their community. Mildred's passion for education and literacy inspired her to create the Whipple Fund in 2003, which is an advised fund, as I said earlier, the OCF. OCF has provided tremendous support to the Whipple Foundation in fulfilling Mildred's goal to facilitate, improve, and enhance lifelong learning in Douglas County. We are pleased to have Greg Chalet, president of the Oregon Community Foundation, but talking with Greg last night, I guess it's for just a short time till the end of the year. There's Greg. Wave your hand, Greg, here today. As well as Laura Winter, Vice President of OCS Advised Funds. I'd like to take a moment or two. There are 5 board members of the Whipple Foundation. They are here today. I think one is Joe Olsen, new president of Umpqua Community College, and I think Joe's going to be a little bit late. So stand up, Joe, if you're here. Carol Whipple. Carol, where are you? Right there. Mildred's daughter and owner of Rocking Sea Ranch. George Murdoch, superintendent of Douglas ESD. Joyce Askey, God, I said that wrong. Sorry. Associate Director, Ford Institute for Community Building, part of the Ford Family Foundation. And I'm Dave Sabala, General Manager of Douglas Electric Co-op. I'd like to recognize a couple of staff. Joan Kearns, Donor Relation Officer who works directly with the Whipple Fund, has been a tremendous asset. And I'm here to tell you, OCF's help has been tremendous. And then I call it our summit leader, Michelle Feldkamp. Without Michelle, this wouldn't happen today. So I'm very, very honored to be associated with all these folks. Several years ago, the Whipple Advisory Committee determined, as a result of research and study, that the most cost-effective, developmentally opportunistic time to make the most significant impact on lifelong learning began before a child steps foot in the classroom. Early childhood education, and that's the message that we have here today. Joe Olsen just came in from, hey Joe, how you doing, from UCC. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our MC. I think everybody knows him, Doug Robertson, Douglas County Commissioner. And just to put in a plug for Doug, he's the most tenured, longest running Douglas County Commissioner in the state of Oregon. Welcome, Doug.
Well, Dave, thank you very much, and thank all of you for taking time out of what we know are busy schedules to be with us this morning in this most important event. I'd like to just take a minute and digress from the agenda. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to introduce Dave Sabala as the recipient of the Roseburg Area Chamber of Commerce First Citizen. And I was absolutely stunned when I read his resume and the amount of time and effort and commitment in terms of volunteering for the various activities in our area. And I mention it because Dave actually sets the gold standard in that regard, and that is, to a large extent, what we're going to be talking about this morning. A community coming together to address an issue that we all know needs very careful consideration and a lot of work. I'm also very pleased to have the opportunity to be with you this morning because a long time ago, I was a young, enthusiastic teacher. And I know what you're thinking, that Doug was actually young once, 43 years ago. And I can remember as though it were yesterday that, and many of you that are educators, current and former, will relate to this. Just a very short period of time in my first job, I began to recognize youngsters that had problems, that were going to be problems. And everybody else recognized them too. And yet we did nothing about it because there wasn't any real infrastructure to address those problems. And I can remember today the faces of those youngsters that had challenges that were going unrecognized and untreated. And thank goodness we have progressed from that time to this, but have an enormous challenge ahead of us in terms of early childhood education. The other reason that I'm delighted to be here this morning is to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker and our governor. Governor Kitzhaber and I have known each other for over 30 years and worked on a lot of projects together. John was born in Colfax, Washington, and moved to Oregon when he was 11. He graduated from South Eugene High School in 1965 and completed his undergraduate work in New Hampshire, schooling in New Hampshire at Dartmouth College. He then came back home and completed his studies and got his medical degree from what is now Oregon Health Science University. And in 1974 came to Roseburg and started his practice as an emergency room physician. John started his political career about the same time I did by getting elected to the Oregon legislature in 1978. In 1980, he ran successfully for the state senate, where he served 3 terms. In 1985, he was elected by his peers to be the president of the Oregon State Senate. And of course, as you know, in 1994, he was elected governor, re-elected in 1998, and in 2010, elected to an unprecedented 3rd term. John is a unique political figure. So often today in the political landscape, we see elected officials who do everything they can to make it appear that they are addressing difficult issues, but actually are doing everything they can to avoid them, doing everything they can to sidestep the contentious and difficult situations faced by their state, their district, whatever it may be. The unique characteristic of Governor Kitzhaber's political career is that he not only doesn't avoid the hard issues, he seeks them out and meets them head on. The Oregon Salmon Plan is a good example, recognizing the need to do everything possible to protect our streams and rivers, our anadromous fish runs, and yet at the same time recognizing the importance of our economy in our rural, resource-dependent communities. The governor did everything he could to thread that needle and did so very well. Healthcare. What is more contentious than healthcare? And here again, working with the legislature, the governor put together a package that came to be the Oregon Health Plan, a plan that has impacted tens of thousands of Oregonians who, but for that plan, would not be able to receive the medical services they so desperately needed. And so here we are today, talking about another very difficult issue, education. And where's the governor? He's right in the middle of it, working again with the legislature to see that Senate Bill 909, which is the platform that provides for the appointment of the Oregon Education Investment Board, a board which will streamline and economize and make more efficient a system of education delivery that is broken and fractured and simply isn't working very well today. And among those components is a very important area of early childhood education. And we're very fortunate to have the person who not only has the passion and the commitment to make that work, but also the leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, join me, won't you, in welcoming Oregon's Governor, John Kitzhaber.
Thank you very much, Doug, for that kind invitation. I'd like to thank the Whipple Fund Foundation and the Oregon Community Foundation for all their support. I'd also like to thank Jim and Jane Ratzlaff, longtime friends of mine who hosted a delightful dinner last night for the speakers of this program. I'd like to thank First Lady Sylvia Hayes, who's come down with me today. Thank you very much, dear. And I'd also like to recognize Tim Freeman. Is Tim out there somewhere? There he is. I just want to start by reminding you of what a remarkable thing this legislative session accomplished. Beyond the work on healthcare, beyond the Early Learning Council, we balanced one of the largest per capita debts in the nation, bigger than California's, bigger than Washington's, with civility, without tearing the state apart, without vilifying one another. And a lot of the credit has to go to the leadership of the legislature, Co-Speaker Hannah from your community, Tim Freeman. And so I want to take just a moment and have us all recognize the tremendous work and the great leadership you have in the Oregon legislature. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today about what we're doing to improve early childhood success, which is one of the key priorities of my administration. I think we all recognize, particularly people in this room, that the science on early childhood investment is extraordinarily clear, and it's convinced me that a sustained and strategic investment in the success of early children aged 0 to 5 is a key to ensuring that our children grow up to be healthy, productive adults, and also it's central for Oregon to meet its long-term educational and economic objectives. As I just mentioned, when I came into office, we were faced, like many states, with a huge budget challenge, highlighted by chronic unemployment and this massive budget deficit. I think it's significant to point out that the state of Oregon adopted a somewhat different approach than many other states. We have not lost sight in Oregon and did not lose sight in Oregon during these difficult fiscal times of our long-term vision of a state where every child is ready to learn when they get to school, where kids have the attention and the resources to learn and teachers have the time and the support to teach, where dropout rates are declining and graduation rates are increasing, where all of our high school graduates are prepared for post-secondary education or training without the need for remediation, where 80% of them go on and get at least 2 years of post-secondary education and training, and 40% of those get at least a baccalaureate degree or higher, and we've driven the per capita income back up above the national average at every county of the state of Oregon. I want to live in a state that looks like that. And I think you want to live in a county that looks like that. And we all know that we can't simply wait for better times to begin investing in the future. So we knew that we had to take action in the 2011 legislative session, notwithstanding the tremendous fiscal pressures that we were under, because it's increasingly clear that the systems through which we deliver important public services, whether it's to early kids, whether it's education, public safety, health care, are simply broken. The systems were designed in the last century. They're not up to meeting the needs of the challenges we face today. And the fact is that even the most rosiest revenue forecast is not going to keep up with the growing cost of medical care, the growing cost in our public safety system, or this siloed, outdated system through which we try to finance public education. So we decided that we needed a new approach, and we recognized that investing in the success of early children is the foundation for long-term success. It's the foundation for reducing downstream costs in public safety and costs in our social service system. There was a recent article in Planet Money that called preschool the very best job training program that we could possibly have. And I couldn't agree more. This period between birth and 4 or 5 years old is the time when kids can develop these soft skills, the ability to engage one another, the ability to solve problems and to manage anger. And studies, and I'm sure you'll hear from people who know a lot more about this than I do later on in the program, show that kids who actually are exposed to quality preschool education gain these skills, and as a result are much more likely to be employed, much more likely to be successful as adults than kids who don't get this. And they're also less likely to get sick. They're less likely to drop out of school. They're less likely to need social supports or be involved in the criminal justice system. But the fact is that in Oregon, and I think most states in our country, far too many of our children are growing up without the family and community supports that are necessary to make them successful and independent learners. We have about 45,000 children born each year in this state, and 45% are considered at risk due to a series of well-recognized factors that occur in the home and in the community long before they ever go to school. They're living in poverty, they're hungry, they have an unstable family situation, they have family members who are involved in the criminal justice system or who are suffering from substance abuse of one form or another. And overcoming those challenges, I think, very early on is the key to avoiding and having to pay for the all too familiar costs downstream, which involve the criminal justice system, which involved chronic involvement with our social support network. The challenges that face our current system, I think, are all too familiar, and hopefully today we're going to stop talking about them and start doing something about them, and I think Douglas County is poised to lead the way. We spend in this state about $750 million every 2 years in state and federal resources on kids 0 to 5 across 12 different agencies, dozens of independent programs which are not connected with one another, often which don't consistently measure outcomes, and yet less than half of the children at risk under the age of 5 are receiving the support that they need to be successful learners when they get to kindergarten, in the face of $750 million of expenditures, which is pretty darn hard to justify as a return on investment, particularly in these difficult economic times. We have many students that start behind the curve, and many of them that come to school with this achievement gap never catch up. Only 25% of our children are meeting state reading benchmarks today in the first grade, only 25%. And that creates counseling and remediation problems in our school system that pulls dollars out of the classroom. We all know that high school graduation rates are far too low in the state of Oregon. Only about 2/3 of Oregon high school students are graduating today. And the graduation rate among African Americans, among our Hispanic and Latino students and Native Americans are less than half. Simply not acceptable. Fewer than 25% of Oregon students are college ready when they leave high school. We spend 20% of our community college budget on remediation, things that kids should have received when they were going through high school. So for many reasons, including inadequate preparation, inadequate resources, many students who actually do enter community colleges and universities don't ever finish and don't get that degree or technical certificate that's absolutely necessary to be competitive in a global economy. So what's the net result of all this? It's pretty shocking when you think about it. We have a generation of Oregonians now who are growing up less educated than their parents, less educated than the U.S. average, and less educated than students in many of the countries which we are going to have to compete with in a global economy. Now, to address this, we, in this last session, have targeted 3 areas for policy and system changes to achieve the goal, and it's a very simple, straightforward goal, of ensuring that all of our children are ready to learn when they get to kindergarten, are ready to read when they enter first grade, are reading when they leave first grade, and are reading at level in the 3rd grade. And that is a powerful predictor of their ability to actually graduate, get into the workforce, and be successful, productive citizens and members of our economy. All 3 of these are embodied in Senate Bill 909 that Doug mentioned, and a big chunk of that is focused on what's called the Early Learning Council that will really tee this up and make the investments and create the system and the infrastructure to achieve that objective. So the first area is early identification and support. And in that area, we need to do a much better job identifying the kids and the families who need support through standardized screenings for these kids so that we reach the at-risk kids and children as early as we possibly can. We also need to establish neighborhood catchment areas located around elementary schools where a family support manager will coordinate the various resources that that family needs to be successful, not just before they get into school, but those supports need to follow that child right into the primary and secondary school system. The second area is measurement and shared accountability. We've got dozens of private and public and not-for-profit agencies in the early childhood space, all out there doing their thing in their own silos. We want to convert all those contracts to performance contracts and hold them accountable for reaching very specific identified goals. We also need to require outcome measures through all the developmental domains: child health, child language, literacy and learning, social, emotional, cognitive development, and family support and development. We need a system that's accountable, and we need to do performance contracts and metrics to make sure that that's the case. We also need to adopt a kindergarten readiness assessment as a part of this program, and we need to deploy an integrated statewide child-based data system to allow us to track and document our return on investment for the dollars that we're spending. The third area is budget and governance, and that involves creating an early learning council that will essentially consolidate and streamline our existing programs and funding streams with a director who holds a cabinet-level position in the governor's office. That Early Learning Council was appointed about 3 weeks ago. We've hired our director, and we are up and ready to go. We've also set some very ambitious, I think, but achievable goals for this work. Within 2 years, we want to have at least 60,000 children being served. That's a 50% increase over today. And we want to make sure that 70% of the kids who are served are actually meeting state benchmarks for kindergarten and first grade reading by 2020. Now, let me add that the Early Learning Council, as Doug mentioned, is just the first step in trying to create a seamless 0 through 20 education system that will be based on outcomes and provide these better outcomes for students and more resources for teachers and clearly a better value for the taxpayers. Now, these changes that we're proposing are pretty profound. It's a sea change. It's not an incremental change. It's a big change in how we do business. And they're going to be difficult to achieve because the fact is there's a whole host of people and organizations, all with the best of intentions, who are tightly attached and adhered to the current way of doing things. So success of this early learning strategy is ultimately going to depend on our ability to overcome the inertia of the status quo. And what we need people to understand, and what I hope you will help people understand down here in Douglas County in Southern Oregon, is that we have right now a once-in-a-generation opportunity to leverage this budget crisis into something profoundly important for the lives of our kids. And we need a few places that are going to step up and provide leadership for that. And I think Douglas County is one of those places. You have the leadership, I think, and you have the commitment to get it done. But it's going to take all of you. It's going to take the leadership in the legislature. It's not every community that has the Speaker of the House sitting there in the room. It's going to take your business leaders, particularly your business leaders. I mean, this is the workforce of the future. It's going to take leadership from labor. It's going to take leadership from the civic sector because this is going to be hard. And it's going to be hard because the tragedy of America today is that we are a just-in-time, want-it-right-now society. And it's really hard to show a return on investment on the money we spend on early childhood in a 2-year budget cycle. But if we don't do it in Oregon, and if we can't do it now during these fiscal times, we're going to miss the boat. So I want to leave you with a story. Some of you have heard. It's a powerful story by a friend of mine named Kim Stafford, who teaches writing at Lewis and Clark. And I was very honored to have him as one of the speakers in at my inauguration. And it's a story, I think, that very powerfully captures what we're about here. It's a metaphor for what we're trying to do with the Early Learning Council and for what we're trying to do collectively as a group gathered here this morning. And what we're trying to do, essentially, given the fact that you can't see a return on investment tomorrow or next year or 2 years down the road, is we're planting a seed for tomorrow. And what we need to make people understand is that without planting the seed and without nurturing the seed, every day, long before it breaks the ground and before it ever sees the sunlight, we can't possibly reap the fruit that seed is ultimately going to bear. And this story is a true story. It's called a Lloyd story. And it goes like this. Lloyd Reynolds, the international citizen of Portland, spent his last days silent, unable to speak or to write, lying in a hospital bed. On his last day at home, as his wife scurried to pack his suitcase for the hospital, Lloyd made his way outside, and there she found him in the garden, on his knees, awkwardly planting flower bulbs with a spoon. "Lloyd," she said, "you're never going to see those flowers bloom." He smiled at her. He said, "They're not for me. They're for you. Salmon coming home, they're for you. The calls of the wild geese, they're for you. The last old trees, they're for you and your children to the 7th generation and beyond. They're all blooming into being for you." That's what we're about. We need to communicate people that this isn't about a little more money. This is about changing the future. And that work starts now. It starts right here, tomorrow, next week, and for the next 6 months. And let's start it right here in Douglas County. Thank you very much.
Governor, thank you very much for that very powerful message. I want to recognize a couple more folks in the audience. Chief of Police Roseburg, Jim Burge, is with us. Jim, there he is. City Manager Eric Swanson. Eric, where are you? There's Eric. District Attorney Rick Wiesenberg. Rick. Chairman of the Cow Creek Tribe, Michael Rondo. Michael, I think you're here. And also with us, and a person who has been dedicated for all of her adult life to issues dealing with children, former chairman of the tribe as well, Sue Schaefer. Sue, I saw you. Well, we're very fortunate to have with us one of the leading experts in early childhood education and psychology, Dr. Ross Thompson. Dr. Thompson's work focuses on understanding the psychological development of children, especially in the early years of life, and to apply what we've learned to improve programs, practices, and policies affecting children and their families. Dr. Thompson's presentation will include how the brain develops early in life and how certain interventions can make a big difference in the long-term outcomes for children and society. Dr. Thompson is a member of the Board of Directors of 0 to 3 and a scientific advisory board of the National Institute for Early Education Research. Ladies and gentlemen, please help us welcome Dr. Ross Thompson.
Thank you. Well, all that I can say is, wow. I have spoken to groups like this before. I have never heard a chief executive of a state speak with such conviction and with such insight into the importance of investing in early childhood development. I was prepared to be before you today and to say it's wonderful to be in a state where the legislature works and where the governor and the legislature seem to be able to work together. And now I need to say that it is an absolute honor to be in a state where your governor has the kind of insight and understanding about the importance of the early years that he does. And I am grateful for you being here and taking some of your important time this morning to learn a little bit more about these issues. I think it's fair to say that we live in historic times. We live in times that people are going to be writing about and talking about in years to come. I say that with feeling because my sons grew up during the Clinton years, and they used to complain that nothing exciting was happening. There'd be nothing that they'd have to tell their children about, and I don't think they're complaining any longer. With the exception of the football success of the Oregon Ducks, many of the things that people are going to be talking about during this period of time are going to be somewhat discouraging things. We are working our way through a national recession of historic proportions. We are working our way through foreign involvements in wars and conflicts. We are seeing how the Arab Spring will make its way into hopefully a renaissance in the Arab world. But we are living in historic times for another reason as well, and that has to do more positively with enduring changes in our understanding of early childhood. We are not going back to the days in which we believe that the early years were a period of carefree delight, but where nothing much of importance happens relevant to later achievement and adult success. And the work on brain development has helped to change our understanding in historic ways of the importance of the early years of life. And the recognition not just from brain development research of how significantly the mind is growing in the early years, but now in other research that is showing us how early childhood lays the foundation for school success and how significantly the experiences of the early years set the stage for lifelong health, achievement, and well-being. And the crucial central conclusion underlying this revolutionary change in our understanding of early childhood is a realization that early experience becomes literally built into children's bodies and brains. Early experience becomes incorporated, built into children's bodies and brains. And as a result, we bear in ourselves, in how we think, in our health, in our adult success, the legacy of the investments that were made in us in the early years, as we in turn are being called to make that kind of investment in young children today. This has resulted in unprecedented public interest in early childhood development, not just for our children, not just for the children that we take care of at home, but for all children, other people's children as well, because what happens to them affects us all. There it is. Now, developmental brain science has taken the lead in this new understanding of early childhood development, but not just developmental brain science. Developmental neuroscience, yes, but also developmental psychology and the economics of human capital formation are together yielding a common focus on development in the early years. Their convergence makes this common conclusion about the importance of early childhood investments particularly powerful. Now, when I talk about the economics of human capital formation, I'm talking about the work of economists like James Heckman, who are asking about where are the origins of the kinds of complex technological skills, the flexibility of thinking, the adaptability of training that contributes to the development of a workforce that will power this economy into this increasingly complex technological information-driven age that we have moved into. And they, too, are focusing on the skills that are developed in the early years as the foundation for those kinds of capabilities. They point to the fact that some of the most productive economies of the world, such as Singapore, have become that way in part because of a concerted investment in the development of young children that they are now seeing paying off. And at a time when we are facing economic stresses throughout the country of an unprecedented nature, the importance of thinking carefully about where we invest our resources and what kinds of short and long-term payoffs we can find from those investments becomes particularly crucial. It is wise that we should be concerned about the early years, especially when we think about the origins of school achievement. The figure before you is a plot of standardized math achievement scores. And you may not be able to see the figures on the bottom of the screen, but they basically plot math achievement scores at ages 6, 8, 10, and 12 years of age, the primary grades, basically. And they are plotted according to family income levels, with children coming from the most economically advantaged families at the top, those from the most economically disadvantaged families at the bottom, and children from families economically in between in the two middle bars. And you'd see a very similar pattern if I were plotting standardized reading achievement scores or other kinds of cognitive capabilities. And what this figure shows are at least two things. First of all, the achievement gap is something that is already apparent as soon as children begin school. So the achievement gap is already there before a child has darkened the elementary school classroom door. And notice the other thing that this figure shows, that as a result of schooling experience, that achievement gap does not narrow, but it widens over time. children's disparities in learning based on family background are only increasing as a result of school experience. They're not decreasing. If the achievement gap is apparent as soon as kids enter school, it means we need to look earlier to understand the origins of these achievement differences. And in fact, in this figure, as we look at differences in vocabulary growth, we can see that emerging. If we begin by thinking about kids coming from lower income, middle income, and higher income homes, we find that they start off roughly equivalently at 18 months of age, not surprisingly, because this is when the vocabulary explosion has yet to take off. But as soon as kids start acquiring that enormous increase in the knowledge of words and the ability to use them, we already begin to see that differences according to family income level are emerging, such that by the time they reach their third birthday, children coming from the most economically advantaged homes are already using many more words than our kids from less economically advantaged families. Other research tells us that this is because children are hearing different amounts of vocabulary in their everyday experiences at home. Quite literally, children in more economically advantaged homes are finding adults who are talking to them more commonly than in other homes. And other studies show us that the way that language is being used is also very different, with language in well-off homes being used to help flesh out and elaborate and expand upon a child's everyday experience in the context of conversations and also in the context of storybook reading and storytelling, as opposed to being language being used primarily for purposes of controlling and guiding and correcting children's activities. So what we find is that the achievement gap is already beginning to emerge in the first 3 years of life in areas that really matter, in areas that we really care about, such as the growth of vocabulary. And what we are also seeing is that this kind of cognitive achievement is directly linked to the kinds of social and relational experiences children have in the homes in which they're growing up. And what we know is that these differences in cognitive achievement, in behavioral growth, are entirely consistent, indeed are built upon what we know about the developing brain. So if you'll excuse me, I would like to spend a little bit of time talking with you about some of the core concepts of brain development. Because I think what the research in developmental neuroscience is doing is it's adding greater urgency to our concern about how children are developing because of what it is telling us about how the brain is affected by their experiences. The first of these core concepts is one that I think you're probably very familiar with. You've heard it before. And simply it is that experience shapes brain architecture. We know that as the brain begins developing, and this begins, by the way, prenatally, not long after conception, neurons begin being generated at an incredible rate, such that the brain becomes, by the time of the child's first birthday, a more densely packed organ than it will ever be at any time in the future. The reason for this incredible, great proliferation of neurons in the developing brain is to create an organ of astonishing learning potential. The brain has to be an organ of astonishing potential because the brain has no idea where the accident of birth has placed that child and what kinds of experiences and knowledge will be necessary. To take a simple example, the brain has no idea at birth whether that child has been born into Moscow, Seoul, South Korea, Paris, or Berkeley. And as a result, that brain has to be prepared to learn Russian, Korean, French, English, or any other language. That's why that overproduction of neurons occurs. By the time a child is 6 months of age, that child is capable, because of this, of being able to make out every phoneme of every one of the world's languages. The child is quite literally a citizen of the world. The problem here is that a brain with that kind of potential and overproduction of connections works very inefficiently. And so, for the brain to become a more efficient learning machine, those synapses, those connections have to be pared away. Pared away on the basis of experience to help create a brain that is ideally adapted to the living circumstances in which the child has found themselves. As a result, by 12 months of age, the child has stopped being a citizen of the world. Their speech perception is now entrained to the language the child has been overhearing all these months of life. But the child has also become an extraordinarily efficient language learner, capable of that kind of vocabulary explosion I just showed you a few months ago. That's the incredible character of brain development, all occurring in the early years. Now, what I've just described to you is a process by which there's an overproduction of synapses, an overproduction of brain connections, followed by its gradual decline as a result of experience. And the next thing I need to tell you is quite simply that that happens in different areas of the brain according to different timetables. So it occurs, for example, early on, beginning at birth, with respect to basic processes of vision, of hearing, of touch, basic sensory pathways, because those are the kinds of brain processes that are foundational for everything that follows. And then I just described to you how it occurs with respect to language a little bit later. So as children begin after the first year to learn language, you're already seeing those synapses, those brain connections becoming paired to make the child an ideal language learner, Russian language learner, English language learner, French language learner. That process of brain proliferation of connections followed by its gradual withering away to save those that are important continues on, so that the higher cognitive functions, the ones that we care about having to do with the child's capacity for, for problem solving, for inductive reasoning, for thinking, for more complex self-regulatory skills, has a much more extended developmental timetable. Indeed, this figure needs to be redrawn because it really continues on throughout the adolescent years. But what this figure also shows is the ways in which the development of those more complex skills builds on the foundation established early on. If the sensory pathways are not in place, language becomes impaired. If language and vocabulary and other literacy skills are not in place, higher cognitive functions become impaired. And as a result, brain development is cumulative in this way. Now, what the brain science is telling us is also something more about how the mind develops. And what that developmental neuroscience is telling us is that the developing young mind is remarkably active and capable and self-organizing. All these things are happening as a result of the brain's internal drive to grow and to adapt itself to the world in which the child has been born. And as a result, knowledge grows not through passive instruction, but through the child's active experience and engagement in the world. What this means in a very important practical sense is that a high-quality early learning environment looks much different than a high-quality learning environment for older children, because the brain is at different stages of development at different places of life. Research has shown that if you put 5-year-olds into a classroom environment that is more suitable for 5th graders, you don't end up with children who learn more. You end up with young children who are more frustrated, who doubt their abilities, and have learned less, compared to putting them in an age-appropriate learning setting. That's important for us to know, because we know what are the elements of a high-quality early learning setting. It is one in which there is lots of language, in which there is a lot of social interaction with peers and with teachers. My wife is a gifted early childhood educator. Most of what I know about young children comes from her. And her instincts tell her that when a classroom for young children, for preschoolers, is quiet, something's wrong. In the same way that my sister, who is an elementary school teacher, will say, if there is that kind of noise in a 5th grade classroom, something is wrong. But that's because the brain is at a very different stage of development for children at each age. That kind of high-quality early learning environment involves lots of teacher guidance, but children's choices to capitalize on what they've become interested in at the moment. It involves small class sizes, warm relationships, and a whole lot of learning, not by telling, but by doing. And all these practices that we now find are part of high-quality early childhood education are based on what we know about the brain stage of development. Now, as part of that high-quality early learning environment, another thing that is important that the brain science has shown us is the ways in which brains are shaped by what we call the serve and return quality of human interaction. By serve and return, I'm trying to pull forth this idea of volleying back and forth, as you might see in a tennis or a volleyball match, of ideas and information and perspective and feelings and experiences that goes on between a child and an adult or an older person. And what the research is telling us is that more than any commercial product that is out there, more than any baby Einstein toy, more than any early childhood curriculum that you can purchase on the marketplace, it is the quality of sensitive interaction with a responsive adult that is food for the developing brain. And the remarkable thing is that, therefore, adults are at the center place of that early learning environment, that high-quality learning environment from which young children gain. And that does not begin at the time that a child enters preschool. It begins, literally, at birth. When simply the kind of babbling, baby talk, sing-song voice that all of us lapse naturally into when interacting with a young baby turns out to be ideally suited for what the developing brain is capable of responding to at that point in time. So even men who find themselves becoming embarrassed when somebody happens to catch them babbling to their newborn infants, by doing what comes naturally, they're doing what is ideally suited for that child's level of brain development. As children get older, of course, and as their vocabulary and language skills begin to emerge, that serve and return now moves in the direction of identifying common objects and experiences that the child runs into as a way of helping to feed into that developing language skill. As children get older and literacy skills become part of the picture now, storybook reading and the ability to associate a printed text with language and with experience becomes part of that serve and return. Later on, children become capable of doing that with other partners, not just adults, including peers. And as they reach the primary grades, that becomes supplemented now by the expansion of literacy in the child's own production of written artifacts. But notice how much of this occurs before children have even entered an elementary school classroom. That's how the foundations of lifelong learning have their basis in what is going on in the early years. Notice in the centrality of that serve and return between a child's experience and the response of a sensitive adult. The capability of that adult to respond is absolutely central. And for those of us who study young children, we devote particular attention to what happens for children when the relationships on which brain development relies are awry, when a mother is depressed, when a family is stressed by economic or other kinds of difficulties, that serve and return is impaired. And this leads us to recognize something that is the dark secret of early brain development research. It's the other side of the importance of the brain being sculpted by early experiences that we don't often talk about, but it's important to recognize. And that is that the experiences that shape and are incorporated into brain architecture can be positive or negative. Both kinds shape the developing brain. We are commonly thinking about the ways in which common human experiences help to make that brain optimally suited for the world in which the child is living. The experience of listening to language, for example, helping to make that child a language learning machine of English, Russian, French, or Korean. We also know that unique personal experiences throughout life help to shape our brains. When I have more time speaking to an adult audience, I'll ask how many of us here are regular athletes? How many of us here spend time writing poetry or composing music? Because those experiences shape the way in which your brain is already functioning. But the important thing to also recognize, the double-edged sword here, is that stressful, traumatic experiences early in life also become incorporated into developing brain architecture. They become part of how the brain fashions itself to get ready to live in the world around them. And one reason this is true, one reason this is important, is because of the integration of all the various functions that the brain helps to regulate. In particular, that cognitive, social, and emotional development are deeply interdependent in the early years of life. Some of you know that I dashed up here after teaching an undergraduate class at the university. The class that I teach is social and personality development. We divide up development, of course, when we teach it into different areas. There's even a different class that students take if they want to learn about cognitive and perceptual development. But the fact is that that is not a brain-based way of understanding how kids grow. Rather than different compartments of the brain developing independently one from the other, what we understand is that those different aspects of the brain's functioning are deeply connected, are deeply tied to each other. How the child is doing emotionally, how the child is functioning socially, has a great deal to do with a child's capacities to learn. And we see this in the architecture of the brain. I'm not sure how well you can see this figure, but what I'm going to do is just simply identify 3 areas of the brain. One of them, this chili-shaped small red structure in the middle, is called the amygdala. That is the fight or flight part of the brain. It is deeply rooted biologically, and it develops very early. It's the part of the brain that is activated if you are feeling threatened or terrorized by some experience that you've encountered. Located right next to the amygdala, indeed connected to it, is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a part of the brain that governs the function of new memories from current experience. If later on today you tell a coworker about what you learned this morning, it's because, fortunately, your hippocampus is activated. It is storing new memories of current events. And finally, this large part right toward the front of your brain that you would cover if you covered your forehead with your hand is called the prefrontal cortex. It is the part of the brain that is slowest to develop, and it is the part of the brain that governs self-regulation and many higher cognitive functions. Now, the reason for pointing these three out to you is that they are deeply connected to each other. They develop in synchrony, and they function in a way that affects other parts of it. Medical research has shown, tragically, that for Vietnam War and other war veterans who have experienced, for example, the regular, intense activation of that fight or flight amygdala, we are finding now that the hippocampus, as a result of that, constant activation of the amygdala, has itself been altered physically and is less well functioning because of the activation of the fight or flight response. Likewise, in young children, we find that children who are not able to function well in a classroom because of their emotional or behavioral dysregulation, who have trouble getting along with teachers and kids, who have trouble controlling their own feelings, who have trouble paying attention. Their troubles in paying attention and in thinking in the classroom are directly tied to these kinds of emotional difficulties they're having getting along with others. And that is well reflected in the nature of brain neurophysiology. So for children to learn well in a classroom, we have to attend to how they're doing emotionally and how they're functioning socially. For children who are facing undue levels of stress, what in our field we call toxic stress, this is particularly important because we know that early childhood stress influences developing brain architecture. That when children, as a result of family experiences, as a result of neighborhood danger, as a result of other things going on in their lives, experience chronic, severe, or uncontrollable stressful experiences, we know that this can cause their stress management systems to respond at lower thresholds. That is, they become more hyperactive with less provocation. And that, in turn, impairs learning and memory. Now, when I speak to early childhood groups, they know exactly what I'm talking about because they can readily identify the children in their classroom who overreact aggressively to a peer's provocation, react to things that another child would never respond to, or who fall apart emotionally when they're frustrated by something not succeeding that they're working on, or who have trouble coping when a teacher reprimands them for something that they have done. And what the developmental neuroscience is telling us is that this may arise because of how the brain itself has been shaped by experiences of stress. Remember I told you earlier the brain doesn't know whether the child has been born in Moscow or Seoul or Paris. Remember that? It turns out that the brain also does not know whether the child has been born in Broadway or Beirut. That is, the brain does not know whether the world the child has been born into is a world full of threat and danger or a world full of security and safety. And in the same way that early experiences teaches the brain what kind of language to learn, early experiences also teach the brain what kind of stress to prepare for. So children whose early experiences are full of threat and danger, threat that may arise from growing up in a home where parents are unresponsive or incapable of caring for the child, danger that grows from growing up in a home where parents are themselves abusive, are teaching the brain that this is a world full of danger, and the way to respond and adapt to that world is be able to react immediately. And as a result, these children become overreactive, even in circumstances like school that are not threatening or dangerous. These are the kids who readily become identified, as your governor earlier indicated, as being the problem kids. These are the ones who have trouble learning as a result. And we actually see this effect on developing brain architecture. Remember I identified for you earlier the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, those areas of the brain relating to forming new memories and self-regulation? Okay. In the top figure, we see how these areas relating to thinking and learning develop under normal circumstances. In the bottom figure, how they develop in chronic stress. Again, the lighting of this slide isn't what I'd like it to be, but what you will see is that in the context of normal experiences, these areas of the brain form a proliferation of connections that is exactly what we want to see. In a context of chronic stress, those connections are impoverished. Those areas of the brain are less activated and less well connected to other areas. By contrast, if we look at the amygdala, that area of the brain relating to fight or flight, we find exactly the opposite. In the context of normal experiences, the amygdala has an appropriate number of connections to other brain regions, including those governing thinking and memory. In the case of chronic stress, because the amygdala has been activated so often, it is now rampantly connected to many other areas of the brain and capable of stimulating them in appropriate but inappropriate circumstances. To summarize what I've been presenting thus far, when we think about the three major areas, three major themes of research that have revolutionized our thinking about early childhood development, when we think about the brain development research, when we think about our new understanding of the roots of early learning and school readiness, and when we think about the area that I work most strongly in, having to do with young children's social emotional functioning, we are finding now that they are deeply interconnected. The incredible explosive growth of the brain makes possible the kind of advances, remarkable advances in learning in young children that cause us to focus on early childhood development. And at the same time, the kind of stimulation arising from a high-quality early learning environment further stimulates the brain to further grow and develop. Social and emotional functioning is deeply linked to how well kids can learn in a classroom. And at the same time, as children are learning about their emotions and about other people, it helps them in channeling and managing their own social and emotional capabilities. And finally, the development of the brain is helping to unfold a child's emotional life. But children who are facing emotional challenges and toxic stress in their everyday experience, that has an effect on brain development that in turn feeds back on capacities for learning. And the important thing about early childhood is that all these processes begin very early because of how plastic the brain is, how flexible it is, how malleable it is. And what occurs in the early years has a legacy that continues on as children get older. Does this make sense so far? Okay. As a research psychologist, this is usually where I stop because this is the body of our knowledge. But increasingly, I find it's important to ask, even as a scientist, how should we act on this science? Because we are in a position now, not only as a result of basic brain science, but also as a result of a number of applied studies in early education, to benefit from more than a decade of work on the translation of science into policy and practice. When Governor Kitzhaber talked about this being an historically unique opportunity, he was speaking truthfully from the point of view of what the science gives us, not just from the point of view of Oregon's opportunities, because we now know much more about what to make of this science. Here are some of the implications I draw from this, from what I've told you, and from other bodies of research. First, it is much more cost-effective, both biologically and economically, to prevent problems from developing than to remediate them later. By the time you reach an adolescent who is presenting with conduct problems and has become acquainted, shall we say, with juvenile authorities as a result, many of the brain processes relating to stress neurobiology have already become consolidated in that adolescent. It doesn't mean that there's no hope. It simply means that the duration and the expense of the interventions necessary to essentially retrain that brain to respond differently and more constructively are going to take a much longer time and a more extended effort than if that child is identified early when the brain is plastic. So it's biologically more cost-effective because of the stage of brain development. It's economically more cost-effective for the same reason. The second conclusion I draw is that we need to pay attention to all aspects of early growth: physical health, cognitive, social, and emotional. It is easy, and I think it's been our mistake thus far, to focus on cognitive and language skills as though these can somehow be divorced from the whole complexion of a child's life. But what the integration of the developing brain tells us, especially for children at risk, is that you can't have one without the other. You can't pretend that you're going to develop cognitive skills and teach letters and numbers and help children develop mathematical ability for a child who is under chronic stress and who is regularly having difficulty functioning in a classroom for that reason. So attending to all aspects of development is essential, and I include physical health here as well because some of the newest science is telling us that how children are functioning in terms of health, that this includes exposure to chronic disease and obesity, are also part of this developing picture. As I've indicated, early stressful experiences may impair cognitive as well as social emotional capabilities. And for kids who are in stress, those social emotional capabilities may be crucial. We may have to address the effects of stress on a child's capacity to feel safe in a classroom before that child can pay attention and be able to learn. Because of the importance of the serve and return quality of early relationships, we have to incorporate close relationships into efforts to improve children's outcomes. This may involve two-generational interventions where we're not only helping parents become better parents, but grandparents help those parents become better parents. It also means that we have to pay attention to who are those who are providing support in an early childhood education classroom, and to ensure that they are aware of the qualities of early learning and the kinds of influences they have over that. And finally, we have to begin early, even prenatally. When the brain has its most explosive growth, we have to be patient and we have to invest with long-term yields in mind. As Rob is going to tell you in a few minutes, we know how to create high-quality early learning environments for young children. That is not at all the mystery here. We know what the research is telling us, and we know how to apply it. What we are now facing, especially in this difficult economic time, is how to get the investment that we need. And the irony here is that for a long time in this country, we have had a mismatch between the opportunities presented by the nature of children's development at different stages of life and the amount that we've been willing to invest. Now, again, my slide is not doing a good job for me, but the light blue line is what neuroscience is telling us about the brain's malleability, how much we can do things that are going to shape the developing architecture of the brain. And the golden line is the one that highlights how much spending as a nation we put into health, education, and welfare. And as you'll see, we as a country have invested relatively little in the early years of life when the brain's malleability is its greatest. We've increased progressively that investment as children move into elementary, secondary, and ultimately higher education. And finally, as they move into the adult years in things like remedial education, healthcare, social services, and eventually, for some of us, retirement, that investment is its greatest, even at a time when the opportunities in brain development are developmentally the least. I think that in thinking about how we should go about this process, it's worth recognizing that one size does not fit all, that children in different circumstances do not need the same kinds of investment of resources. And what science is pointing to is kind of a three-tiered approach in which each tier needs to be advanced simultaneously. The most basic one is the provision of the kinds of health services and early care and education that all children have access to in order to help build and sustain strong brains and bodies. And although I've been focusing on early education, healthcare is equally important, in part because of the ways in which a healthcare provider provides avenues for families to be able to mobilize themselves around the healthy development of a child. Some children need more than this, particularly children who are in families facing economic challenges, which many, many more are today. Food insecurity in a home has pervasive effects, not just for the quality of nutrition that children experience, but for the capacities of adults to be able to engage their children productively, free of anxiety and worry about family well-being. For them, broadly targeted interventions to give them a chance to succeed, more than what we need, what children in adequate circumstances need, is what we should be thinking about. And then finally, there is for children who are experiencing toxic stress and other special needs, narrowly targeted specialized services that are also part of our constellation of helping all children be able to get ready. Who is needed, therefore? Well, people like me, to begin providing the scaffolding of knowledge that we can build upon. We need practitioners who can contribute to the implementation. People like my wife who are working with children on a daily basis and are bringing science into their developmentally appropriate practice with children. We need policymakers like your governor, who is already leading the way on systems change in order to ensure that broader social systems are adapting to what our new knowledge of children's needs are. And we also need funders to provide what I call patient capital. One good metaphor for thinking about the investments we make in early childhood development is the one that you heard from Governor Kornhaber, having to do with the planting of a seed that will flourish long after that initial investment has been made. For me, the metaphor is digging in an oil field. And this came to me from one of the business people that I met at Governor Sarah Palin's Alaska Early Childhood Summit. That'll tell you a little bit about how long ago that was. But I remember sitting during a break in the session and being introduced to oil company executives. And as we got to converse, they were telling me a little bit about how they go about the process of developing oil fields. And they said, Ross, you know, we invest money in developing a prospective field, but we don't expect that we're going to get any return on that investment in the next 5 years. Indeed, in some cases, we have to plan on a window of at least 10 years before we'll know whether that investment is going to pay off. That's the kind of infrastructure development that is necessary in order to see whether a field is going to reveal itself as being a productive one. We have to invest what he's called patient capital, not on the expectation of a short-term return such as what you can find before the conclusion of a legislative session, but the kind that says, because we know that our investments are based on the best knowledge available, we're willing to wait to see the return. That's the kind of patient capital we need in early childhood development. Starting early, we invest with long-term yields in mind. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you this morning.
Well, Dr. Thompson, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning in that most informative presentation. As we prepare for our next speaker, who will tell us about the connection between early childhood development and education and economics, let's take a few minutes and stand up and stretch, and then we'll introduce our next speaker. Thank you. Natural sequence after the last speaker is certainly going to be provided by our next speaker. Coming all the way to us from Minnesota, Rob is going to talk to us about the connection between early childhood development and education and economics. Rob Grunewald conducts regional economic research and co-authors the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Beige Book, a report on current economic conditions. He also writes articles on regional economy and the economics and banking issues for the Fed Gazette in the region, two periodicals published by the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. Rob regularly speaks to business, community, and school groups about the Federal Reserve and the regional economy. He co-authored Early Childhood Development, Economic Development with a High Public Return, an economic policy paper which has been featured in the media, legislative hearings, and seminars throughout the United States. Rob holds a bachelor's degree in economics and religion from St. Olaf College and a master's degree in applied economics from the University of Minnesota. Please help me welcome Rob Grunewald.
Good morning. It's great to be here. I'm going to start by saying I've got a cold, so hopefully you can understand me. And part of my public health initiative today is I won't shake your hand. I'll just say hello to you today. It's great to be in a community that's coming together around early childhood. Also hearing from the governor and your state's leadership about the changes that are coming forward in early childhood education here in the state. It's a very exciting time. What I want to do today is connect the research that Ross has laid out about brain development to economics. What is the economic impact of investments in young kids? Let me step back for a moment and talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve, because probably when you looked at today's invitation, you saw that there was an economist from the Federal Reserve here to talk about young kids. You might have thought, well, Federal Reserve, this is our nation's central bank. We make money the old-fashioned way. We print it. That is, we regulate the flow of money in our system so that we can keep prices stable and our economy moving. The Federal Reserve is also a bank regulator. We oversee the entire system of payments and the system of payments. And then we also have a very large customer. So here's your trivia question. Who is the Fed's largest customer? For $64,000. You have to think really big. It's the federal government. We are the bank for the federal government. We essentially hold the checkbook for Uncle Sam. So when you look at the Federal Reserve, it may not be obvious why economists are interested at the Fed about investments in young children. Well, if you look across our 12 banks, we're here in the 12th district. Your head office is in San Francisco. There's a branch bank in Portland that helps to serve this area. And I'm from the 9th District in Minneapolis. And each of our reserve banks and our Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. have research departments. We're interested in how monetary policy works, banking and credit, but we're also interested in how economies grow. What are those key ingredients of economic growth? And so you'll see a variety of papers, a number of topics that come from Federal Reserve banks. This research paper originally started with some inspiration from our director of research at the Minneapolis Fed, Art Rolnick. And for some time, he had been looking at how we typically think of economic development initiatives. And so when you think about economic development more specifically, what might come to mind is policies to encourage companies to move into a local area, either by providing a subsidy or preferential tax treatment. And what we noticed in the Twin Cities back in the 1990s is that our two cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, were competing against each other for these companies and offering lots of dollars to private companies to move to their area, essentially across the river to one of the two cities. But at the end of the day, Minnesota wasn't gaining any new jobs. And so we thought as a state, how could we help to ease this competition, not only between Minneapolis and St. Paul, but a lot of our other cities. So Art took this analysis across the country, and recognized that we have competition between states as well. And in a given year, it's estimated that $50 billion is promised to private companies to encourage them to move or relocate into a state or to a county or a city. And at the end of the day, from a national perspective, no new jobs are gained. So what to do? He wrote a paper called Congress Should End the Economic War Among the States. That is, Congress could step in, find a way to essentially level the playing field. One idea proposed in this paper is to tax any set of packages of incentives to a private company at 100%. Well, you would no longer be offering those incentives. Instead, economic development offices would focus on, as what they do, the core ingredients of economic growth in their region. That is, their relative to position to amenities, to natural resources and markets, the infrastructure for communication, for transportation, and also the quality of the workforce. But it does bring to mind an interesting thought experiment. That is, what if we had $50 billion to spend on economic development? Well, first of all, we could lower all business taxes across the country at some percentage instead of having these piecemeal awards to one company or the next. If we want to invest them in economic growth, we'd argue that investing them in human capital is where to put that next dollar. When we look at those countries, those parts of our own country that have well-trained workforces, those are the areas that have higher per capita income levels and higher output per person. This economy now pays a worker with a college degree, 75% more than a worker with only a high school degree. I'm just going to show you a couple slides. You knew you were going to see some charts from an economist. Sure. How's that? Okay, great. What I'm going to do is, here's the outline, the key themes that I want you to walk away with, is that early childhood development is economic development, and that investments early have a high public return. And then I'll talk about some of the initiatives that we can invest in locally here and at the state level to move the early childhood agenda forward. So as promised, here's our charts. So this is the U.S. population working age. And you'll see that the growth that's expected in our working age populations is going to slow over the next few decades. And once the baby boomer generation moves to retirement age, we're expecting that the overall labor force will be growing, but it's going to grow slower than it has in the past. Now, certainly we're in an economic period where this is a slow recovery. We have relatively high rates of unemployment. But we're expecting as we move through this recovery that companies will begin to start noticing that they're having some difficulty finding the available high-quality labor that they need at their manufacturing facilities, at their offices, and other industries. When we have projections of labor looking forward for occupations, those, by 2018, those jobs that require a college degree or some education beyond high school are expected to be the fastest growing job areas. And matching wage rates relative to those education requirements, that we have much higher wages for those workers that have higher levels of education. If you have a bachelor's degree, you're going to be earning 3 times more than a worker that's at an occupation that only requires on-the-job training. So going forward, this continues to be an economy that will require workers with higher levels of skills in education. So investing in our school systems, our colleges and universities are very important. What we'd argue is that we're going to achieve the highest return on that dollar in human capital if we spend it before children arrive at kindergarten. I'm going to outline some long-term studies that ask this question. What if we provided children, especially children who are considered at risk, with a high-quality preschool program or a childcare program or a home visiting program? And what impact might that have on the children and their parents? But also, what is the impact on the investors, on society as a whole? One of the most widely cited studies is the high-scope study of the Perry Preschool program. Now, this program started in the early 1960s. Over 120 children were randomly assigned to attend the Perry project or to be in a control group for comparison. They were able to track the children who were in both of these groups until the age of 40. The children who attended Perry received a high-quality classroom session, half day, with a well-trained teacher, and the teacher went into the home of the child to reinforce those lessons that were learned in the classroom setting in the home environment. So there are a number of differences between the Perry graduates and the children that were in this control group. Achievement scores were higher in the school system. Graduation rates were higher, a 65% graduation rate compared to 45%. Of course, we want to have that 65% higher, but the difference between these two groups will bear out in higher education levels and ultimately higher earnings for those Perry graduates. Also, there was less need for special education. At the age of 40, there were a number of differences between the two groups, including higher home ownership rates, as I mentioned before, higher earnings in the workforce. Coming from the Federal Reserve, I needed to include this last statistic. They're more likely to have a savings account at a bank. Most of the majority of benefits accruing to the public from this investment came from reductions in crime. So all crime rates were reduced by half, felonies all the way down to misdemeanors. And this resulted in about 1.5 years reduction in incarceration. So now we bring in the Economist. We have the Economist conduct a cost-benefit analysis of this project. So first, adding up the cost of the Perry Preschool project, it's $11,000 per child per year. On average, they attended for about 1.5 years. We first see savings to the K-12 system due to reductions in special education. Then higher participant earnings. Most of this is a benefit accruing to the children who attended Perry, but some comes back to the public in the form of higher tax revenue. And then we see savings due to the reduced need for the criminal justice system. That is, reduced need for police protection, court costs, and incarceration costs, and reductions to the cost to the victims of crime themselves. So we add up all of the benefits relative to the cost. It's a very high ratio of benefits relative to cost, 16 to 1. And we can also calculate the annual rate of return. What is that annual interest rate? And so we estimate the total return to the Perry project at 18%. Most of the benefit is accruing to the non-participants. So we estimate that public return at 16%. Very high rate of return. James Heckman, a Nobel laureate economist at the University of Chicago, he and his graduate students went up to Michigan and they reanalyzed all of the data. And after making a couple different assumptions, their recalculated rate of return is 10%. So still very strong. Compared with investments in the stock market over a 30-year period of time, not during the past month, the past week, the rate of return to equities has been about 6% once we adjust for inflation. So it's a very high rate of return. At 10 to 18%, these are the types of returns that don't sit on the table very long in private markets. They do get invested. There are 3 other long-term studies that use high-quality research designs and also apply cost-benefit analysis to a long-term follow-up. The Abecedarian Educational Childcare Project, which was conducted in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, brought in kids into a high-quality educational setting beginning at 4 months until kindergarten, essentially looking at what would be the impact of a high-quality enriched childcare setting. So they were there full day. The parents were also brought in for parent activities and education at the center during the week. They found a number of benefits, including reductions in grade retention and special education. The children at age 21 were less likely to be smoking, and also the children who attended the Abecedarian program were 3 times more likely to attend college as an adult. The Chicago Child Parent Study is a large-scale project in Chicago providing half-day preschool for 3- and 4-year-old children, and also includes parent activities at the center. Here the benefits look very similar to the Perry Preschool project, ratio of 10 to 1 for benefits. Now, different than a center-based project, a home visiting program in which a registered nurse goes into the home and counsels an at-risk mother starting in the pregnancy, through the birth process, and until the child reaches the age of 2, which is now known as the start of the Nurse-Family Partnership Project. They found that the home environments were safer because there was reductions in emergency room visits, there were reductions in welfare costs, and also adolescent crime by the age of 15 for the children that were part of the program. So benefits there of 5 to 1. So all of these ratios are above 1, so that means you're getting your money back and then some. If we convert these to annual rates of return, They range from 7% up to nearing that 20% threshold. So very strong rates of return. And when we ask who benefits the most from these investments, while certainly the children and their parents benefit, most of the benefit, about 60 to 65% of the benefits, accrue to the public. So this means you don't even have to like children to benefit from investing in early childhood programs. You could be Scrooge, before his enlightenment, and achieve a high rate of return. Now, I've articulated long-term benefits. There's also benefits to having a high-quality childcare system in the short term. If you have a high-quality childcare system, this allows parents to enter the workforce. When parents are at work, they're less likely to be concerned or worried about their childcare arrangements. That is, they're less likely to be absent themselves. They're more likely to be more productive in the workplace. And businesses are starting to ask about the availability of quality childcare in particular areas. And that is, they recognize that they need a labor pool in a certain area, and a lot of them are parent employees. And if those arrangements are sound, that means they'll be able to access that labor pool. Sometimes companies even look at how can we help families afford childcare, or even to have an on-site childcare program. So what are some of the key themes from the research on these long-term projects, and also reiterating some themes that Ross shared in his presentation? The first is to invest in quality. That is, in center-based programs, having well-qualified teachers and using a research-backed curriculum and relatively low ratios of children to those teachers. Involving parents is important, even at a center-based program where children might be there for 40 hours a week, that they're connecting to parents, and that they understand what's happening at the center with their child, and also including some activities at the center for parents. Starting early so that our continuum of investments is not just what we're thinking about in terms of preschool, which often becomes our frame for investing in early childhood, but instead that it's a continuum of investments that starts prenatal and goes all the way up to kindergarten. Reaching the at-risk population will achieve the highest rate of return. In Minnesota, we're calling this at-risk population of children our high-return group of kids, because here we can bring prevention dollars and use them more effectively than much more expensive remedial programs later that are less effective. And to bring this research to scale, to look at your state and your own community and add up what are the number of kids who are on Head Start waiting lists. Head Start is federally funded and is provided to families that are at 100% of poverty or below, and is only funded to reach about 50 to 60% of eligible children. Also, basically, we tend to have long waiting lists, waiting lists for child care subsidies in our communities. So these are kids that would all benefit from being reached with a high-quality early childhood program. So moving forward, I'll talk about some investments that can be made locally and are being made in Oregon. The first is home visiting. So as I mentioned before, similar to the Elmira, New York project, where a registered nurse, or a very well-qualified home visitor, goes into the home and is counseling parents, particularly that mother who's in a very vulnerable time, and providing information that can help enrich that environment so that that environment is more conducive to the healthy brain development that Ross talked about in his presentation. So to illustrate what home visiting looks like, I brought with me a video that was produced by the Minnesota Visiting Nurse Agency, which I'm on their board, and it illustrates what it looks like when a nurse goes into a home of, in this case, it's a program that's targeting teen mothers who are poor, and what those interactions and what that information is like. So I always like to get a chance to have my presentation be multimedia. So here we go.
Being able able to be a visiting nurse allows me to provide skilled care for the clients and the families that I see.
I never expect I would have a premature baby.
I was currently living in a shelter, so I had a lot of stress and I was pregnant.
So I was scared and I was like, what's my labor going to be like?
I'm a mom now, so can't really do the same thing I used to do. Well, I had him at 6 months, 24 weeks, and he was pretty small. He came out 1 pound, 8 ounces. Like right there, is that where?
Perfect. And I know the first couple of months were really hard. We had to do a lot of different educational stuff to understand the medications and the timing.
He struggles with it too, and he wants to play, and he can't go outside because I'm worried that he's gonna get sick. I just want to get him off the tube, make him, healthy, feel better.
It's so very important that they recognize if their body is changing or if they are having signs of preterm labor so that they do seek immediate medical attention. And my client did recognize that and was put on bed rest, and her baby did stay in utero longer, which was good for mom and baby. Have you been doing tummy time with her as well?
Yes, and she lifts her head up really high and she's turning.
You're noticing all of those engagement cues that say, play with me, look at me, sing to me, talk to me, feed me. And when you're doing all of those things, she's growing, she's making connections in her brain.
So what that's looking at is called her fine motor skills. So you can see how well all those little muscles in her hands work. And that's another whole piece of brain development.
The home is where we can make such a difference, and starting with them immediately as they're building families and setting goals for themselves can have such a long-term impact.
It's safer him sleeping in a pack and play than sleeping with me.
Consistency is important in the growth and development of the baby. Babies need consistency in their schedule because that's how they learn to trust their parents and trust that somebody is always there to take care of them.
His dad supports me a lot. I have a lot of help. He's a lot of help. That's a blessing.
They have so much promise and so much ahead of them.
This fall, I'll start college at Hamlin.
His lungs sound really good today.
Do it.
Yeah.
I want her to go forward and start a life for herself before she tries to start a life for someone else.
I think education is a key to life. If you know better, you'll do better.
So hopefully that gives you a little picture of what home visiting looks like and feels like. So second, quality childcare. Building our system of childcare so it is of higher quality. In Oregon, there's the Childcare Quality Indicators, a program that helps programs move through and improve their quality, but also providing information to parents about what to look for and how to better shop for childcare. The more information we can provide to parents about how to shop for childcare, it's more likely that they'll arrive at a center. And instead of just being concerned about that center's location and its hours and how much the cost is, they'll start to ask questions about what are the qualifications of the teachers in this program? What type of activities will my child be doing during the day? And looking and sorting out what the quality of those programs are. For preschool, reaching children, especially children from low-income families, with preschool before they go on to kindergarten. In this state, the program that brings together resources and state funds around Head Start and the Head Start, Oregon Head Start pre-kindergarten program is a way to reach children who are at risk early. And parent education, either through classroom-based settings or through a home visiting program to provide information to parents about early childhood development. And healthcare, making sure that children are connected very early to high-quality healthcare is important, but recognizing that medical care is not only what provides the health of the child. In fact, socioeconomic conditions have a stronger impact on that child's health than necessarily their connection to medical care. But we do want to ensure that they have access to high-quality medical care. So finally, I wanted to talk a bit about our own activities in Minnesota and some activity that was inspired by some Minnesota business leaders in Minnesota. They were a group of business leaders that come from large companies in our area, including Cargill, General Mills, Best Buy, and they came to the table inspired by two pieces of research. The first was the research on the return on investment that we've been looking at here, also the brain science, but they were also very concerned about some results from our state school readiness survey. And this is a survey that's conducted by kindergarten teachers, and they're looking at the health and development of kids coming into their classrooms. And what the survey found is that only half of children in Minnesota were fully prepared to succeed in school. Now, this is particularly disturbing for Minnesotans, because, as Garrison Keillor would point out, all the children in Minnesota or Lake Wobegon are above average, and here only half are fully prepared to succeed. So they invested their own, some of their own corporate dollars. They raised money from other foundations and formed the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation. They're funding and have funded our state's quality rating system, which is now going to be going statewide. They've funded a variety of smaller projects, but the one I'll talk about most is a scholarship pilot. And this was a program that was inspired by a proposal that Art Rolnick and I wrote after getting involved in reviewing the research and speaking around the country about investing in young kids. We began to ask, how can economists come to the table and provide some insight in how to further invest and push this envelope forward in investing in young kids. In looking at the center-based market for childcare and preschool, we first recognized that it's a very diverse market. There are for-profit companies, non-profit companies, and there's programs that are sponsored by the public schools, by the state, by the federal government, such as Head Start. But most of the money in that market comes from parents paying tuition to send their children to these programs. So, and the families that aren't accessing the market as well are families that have lower levels of income. So what if we use analogy from higher education? The market actually looks somewhat similar to higher education, to early education. And just as we provide scholarships for kids graduating from high school to go on to college, what if we provided those scholarships early to low-income families with children at the age of 3, so that they have 2 years of a scholarship that can be used at a program of their choice that must meet quality thresholds, and after that 2-year period be more likely to arrive at kindergarten fully prepared to succeed in school. Now, when we first wrote our proposal about this effort, we got a lot of feedback that if you start at age 3 for many families that are facing challenges, this is too late. We would need to start early. So the whole system starts with the home visiting resources in the community. So starting with a registered nurse or highly trained professional home visitor, and starting from there, and then when that child reaches the age of 3, becomes eligible for a scholarship. So a pilot of this model was funded in St. Paul, in 2 neighborhoods where there is a high concentration of poverty. And the researchers who evaluated this program are looking at 3 things. What are the impact on the children in terms of their school readiness? The engagement of parents, because not only were they provided a scholarship, but they were also provided a parent mentor who would visit the home and make sure that that family is staying connected to the program that they have chosen. And then while the dollars are coming into the system from the demand side of the market, shall we say, the supply side is also going to be impacted. So how did the programs respond? Did they choose to get rated? Did more programs move in to the area? First, in terms of child outcomes, there's early data that has some promise that we see test scores are going up for kids after a year of time from when they entered the program until after a year, and data will be collected on what the impact is on the full 2 years. And as we compare this system relative to the child care subsidy system, we find that if you really focus your resources on parents and make the system very efficient, it's more likely for payments to be made on time. It's less likely that families are going to drop out of eligibility because we can keep that payment stream going. So programs are able to provide a continuous level of service to those kids. There was a 70% increase in the number of openings that were considered of high quality in this neighborhood, and also based on parent surveys and parent interviews, parents seem to be more engaged in their child's education. At one focus group, parents described their concern about the quality of the kindergarten classrooms that their children will be going to after they've been in their preschool program or their full-day childcare program. So it's an example of one investment that a community has made in investing in kids through scholarships. Now, I don't have a slide for my next example, but I want to share it with you because it involves a community in northern Minnesota in which started with an event similar to this, in which foundation resources in that area were combined with investments made by the school system and some state funds and also some Head Start funds. And what the community did in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, and I'll share with you, the website and all of that you can go to learn about it, is they created a program called Invest Early. And what they wanted to do is, again, target families who are most at risk, but essentially give them a gateway that was very easy for them to navigate these different services and programs. So families would apply one application. On the backside, the community blended all of these dollars that were available and created some very high-quality early learning programs. And when children from the first cohort arrived at kindergarten, the kindergarten teachers asked, "What did you do to these kids? They're here and ready to learn. This is amazing." And so there has been follow-up on the community. The community evaluators have been looking at how kids have been doing, and that there is signs that these investments have really shifted the type of experiences kids have in their school system, starting very early in kindergarten and through their early grades. So that's Invest Early, and it's coordinated and funded by the Blandin Foundation. So it's an example of a community that's it's much smaller than this community. It's about 6,000 people. But it's an example of where a smaller community can come together and really move the bar on early childhood. Now, the last topic I wanted to discuss, as you see our website, there's a sources page there that if you want to see where all this data comes from, you can certainly get this presentation from your sponsors of this meeting, is the importance of business leadership on this issue. When the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation was created by key business leaders in the state of Minnesota, that helped move the agenda for early childhood forward in our state. There are many different examples around the country where business leaders have come to the table and have helped to move the early childhood agenda forward at the community level and also at the state level. And business leaders essentially have three roles. The first role is to advocate among their peers, get educated at meetings like this, and then talk to other business leaders, either through chambers of commerce or business partnerships, about the importance of investing early. The second is to develop best practices for their parent employees, such as access to childcare, or even bringing in early childhood developmental psychologists and parent educators to the work site to sit down with parent employees and talk about the importance of early childhood development. In Minnesota, business leaders funded the development of a website called Is Your Child Ready?, where parents can go and take a short evaluation and just get a sense of what the type of things that they want to be looking for in their child's development. And third is to come to the table around public policy and advocacy for public policy. That is, come to the table and bring your systems thinking, your strategic thinking to the table, and help move our thinking forward on investing in early childhood. That really took off in Minnesota. The business leaders were able to invest in some projects very quickly that helped to bring some new knowledge about how to invest in young kids in Minnesota. But also, when a group of business leaders come to legislators and come to policymakers and say, invest in young kids, that is going to hold the attention of our elected officials, especially when the elected official is thinking, oh, we're going to talk about regulation or issues around taxation or zoning. Well, those issues can get talked about too, but when the issue of early childhood comes up, it tends to move the agenda forward. So with that, I think we'll move to questions. Thank you very much.
Rob, thank you very much for that presentation. And at this juncture, let's take a couple of minutes. I know Ross and Rob would be anxious to answer any questions or thoughts that you might have. Anybody? Well, let me start. Hank, go ahead.
I'll repeat the point just so that everyone heard. And that is, if you can get a 10% return from investing in early childhood, and we're only making about 2% in T-bills, well, I guess the strategy, if I'm right, well, we could even, we could sell more T-bills, take those dollars and invest it in early childhood, and we're 8% ahead because we're making about 2% on the T-bill. So we have looked, there's a number of business leaders around the country that have come together around how to finance early childhood, and bonding does make sense in this case. That is, if you can borrow at a relatively low interest rate and make the investment up front, and with the earnings downstream be able to pay off the interest on those bonds, is that there is some logic here to how to do that. There has been some movement in what are called social investment bonds or pay-for-performance contracts. That is, if a community can show that you can get kids ready for school, that community could get some dollars, paid straight ahead based on those performance outcomes. So there are some innovations coming in around how to invest in early childhood, not just from our appropriations. But I could share with you, there's about 10 to 15 key strategies on how to invest in early childhood. But you've caught onto the intuition of these type of investments very quickly.
Yes?
So the question is, what, in terms of the scholarships, how much were they, and how did parents navigate the system? So the parents were offered to have their child go to a half-day program or a full-day program. And if they chose a half-day program that was through the school year, the cost of a program like that is about $5,000 per year. Across states, when they invest in 4-year-old preschool, you often see that it's around that $5,000 figure going from 4 to 6. Once you get into longer day, full year, in our state, and particularly in St. Paul, if you are in a full-day, full-year program and are receiving a childcare subsidy, that is about $10,000 per year in our market for St. Paul. And that is not quite at the market rate that most programs charge. That is, some programs would be losing money or parents have to pay a difference there, a gap payment. We estimate that the amount of dollars to provide a high-quality education experience is about 25 to 30% above what the child care subsidy system is paying. So one exercise you might do here is an idea to share, is to look at what child care subsidies are paying here and then think, what if we provided a 25% premium on top of that? We'd estimate that's what programs need to provide a high-quality educational experience. So a full-day, full-year scholarship in the St. Paul program would be $13,000. So that's a large amount of money, but it's also in a fairly high cost area of our country.
Yes.
Sure. So the chart, when I laid out, here's the ratio of benefits to cost. So anywhere from 4 to 1 up to that 16 to 1, those ratios, that basically about 60% of all of that of those higher numbers than 1 are coming from cost savings to government. So that is the 4 to 1 ratio up to the 16 to 1 ratio. Across all of those, you take crime savings. I mean, some of that benefit is due to reducing crime costs. Some from higher tax revenue because you're earning higher tax revenue later because now those children are earning more money in the workforce. You're reducing remedial education costs. So once you add up all of the cost savings across public budgets, and then you add in the benefit to the child, him or herself, or to the parents because they are earning more money in the workforce, you put all of that together, and that's how you get those high ratios. But as I mentioned before, most of the benefit accrues to the non-participants, to the taxpayers. So the question is, if we take typical economic development initiatives and investments and compare them with investments in early childhood development as essentially economic development, what are the returns? And I believe you're referring to a book by Tim Bartek from the Upjohn Institute that was recently released this year. And he's been doing research on what are those returns to a local economy, to investing in economic development. It's kind of interesting because Art Rolnick and I have had debates with Tim over the years about what those numbers are, but we're both in agreement that an investment in early childhood development, in some type of preschool or high-quality childcare setting in particular, will produce more income and jobs than providing a subsidy to a particular private company as an overall strategy. What I like to go back to Art Rolnick's analysis that's basically we should think more broader about our economic development strategies. That is, as a nation, we should be very cautious about providing high-value subsidies to private companies to encourage them to move into a local area, because often they would move there anyway. That this just tends to be gravy on top of their moving decision, that they would have moved to that local area anyway. But nevertheless, when you just put apples to orange, here's apple to apple, economic development investment in luring a company to a local area or investing in early childhood development has a higher return.
Mike?
The question was about food insecurity and hunger and what this means for brain development. This actually is becoming one of the cutting-edge issues, looking at the long-term effects of early childhood experiences. Because in the same way that we've been recognizing that you can't sort of separate out children's social and emotional lives from their cognitive development, we're also recognizing you can't separate out physical health from these psychological processes as well. And what we're discovering is that food insecurity is associated with a host of physical risk factors that end up impacting not only the quality of nutrition that children are experiencing, with its implications for obesity as well as undernutrition, but it also impacts sleep. And there's a vigorous research literature now telling us that sleep ends up being a very important determinant of both cognitive growth and of emotional well-being. The children who are sleep deprived for a variety of reasons are underperforming in classrooms, are not able to self-regulate their own impulses nearly as well. So that's a little bit of a kind of a indication that one of the things that we, especially in these economic circumstances, are needing to have to think about is the total constellation of children's physical experience, and particularly the extent to which parents' own economic insufficiency is having implications for how children are able to function in a classroom and also able to get along with other kids. That is consistent with some concerning information now that is coming from Phil Fisher's lab over at the Oregon Health Sciences Center, University of Oregon, suggesting that if you're thinking about long-term well-being for children, long-term psychological well-being, the experience of chronic neglect, which is often tied to economic insufficiency as well as other family factors, may be simply much more devastating, physiologically as well as psychologically, than experiences, in some cases, of physical abuse. We often think of the maltreating parent as one who is the raging adult who is taking out aggressive acts on a child. But it turns out, of course, that the large majority of kids who come to the attention of Child Protective Services are coming to their attention because of issues of chronic neglect. And now what Phil's research and other research is showing us is that the long-term effects upon children of chronic neglect are at least as serious, and some of that has to do with food insufficiency. Is that helpful? Okay.
Anyone else? I'm going to ask Michelle to come forward and I think make a presentation.
Well, we wanted to thank you both for coming so far and sharing your research and knowledge with our community. This is a first step for us and a great opportunity for Douglas County. And a big deal about going somewhere is always making sure that you can say, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. So we want to present to you both your own pre-K rocks, because we know how important that is. There you go, Rob. Thank you, and thank you both for making the presentations today.
Well, there we have it. So where do we go from here? There are two figures that when I became aware of them, and I think many of you are as well, that have really stuck in my mind. One is 72% of children in our education system in Douglas County are eligible for the free lunch program. 72%. Over 45% of the children in our education program in Douglas County live under the poverty level. Just those two statistics indicate the challenge ahead for all of us. We're doing some things, some actually remarkable things in this county that certainly deserve mention and need to get credit. One is the Family Development Center, an organization that started as the Parent Relief Nursery many, many years ago and has developed into one of the state models for affecting the issues that we talked about this morning. And that continues to be really a source of the activities and services that are so needed. One thing we don't have in this county, Rob mentioned it, and it's been mentioned before, is the Early Head Start program, the home visits for first births. We don't have an Early Head Start program in Douglas County, and it's something that we should look at seriously. I'm happy, very happy, to be able to announce on behalf of the Oregon Community Foundation a very generous donation from the Whipple Foundation of $100,000 as a catalyst, as a beginning of the effort that has been outlined here today, bringing together a group called the Douglas County Champions for Children to start addressing specifically the challenges before us. On the tables in front of you, you will see some information, and there are some opportunities to fill out some interest that you may have. We always need dollars, but we need more than that. We need community support. We need business support. We need volunteers. And to the extent that this community has proved over and over again its generosity and the ability to come together and do so much more together than any one of us individually or as individual entities can do on their own, we have the catalyst here in this community with the leadership of the governor to make a real difference in this issue. So let's take this information and go forward. Again, thank you all for being with us this morning. Thank you.